From the beginning, the DC Extended Universe was underwhelming. It began in 2013 with Man of Steel, a drab and colorless film in more ways than one that answers the question, what if Superman just didn't give a shit? It continued with 2016's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which doubles down on everything that made its predecessor so gloomy and tedious. There's a scene where the U.S. Capitol is bombed with Superman on the scene, and Superman responds to this horrific national tragedy by standing there among the flames and frowning, and as a version of Batman so brutal and grim, even Heath Ledger's version of the Joker would probably advise him to lighten up. By the time the DCEU started, the rival Marvel Cinematic Universe had been humming along for 5 years. Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America had all starred in successful solo films, and the first Avengers movie had been a massive hit. That being the case, it's understandable that DC Comics and Warner Brothers would have wanted to take their film franchise in another direction. There's probably no way they could have avoided being compared to the MCU, but they could at least avoid accusations that they were ripping it off. And the DCEU has definitely been different from the MCU. Unfortunately, it hasn't always been different in very positive ways. MCU films are relatively bright, strike a good balance between humor and drama, and are unashamed of their often very silly source material. The producers of the DCEU chose to counter this by making their films glum, humorless, and almost pathologically preoccupied with convincing the audience of how serious and important they are. No mere funny book adaptations, these. As a result, for the first 5 years or so, the DCEU was awful. Not without exception. The first Wonder Woman film opened in 2017, and it was better, not what I'd call great by any stretch, but miles and miles better than anything the series had produced up to that point. But these last couple of years, things have kinda sorta turned around, or at least started to. The quality of the productions set in the DCEU has noticeably improved. In fact, there have been 7 movies or TV shows released as part of the DCEU since 2018, and all but one have at least been not terrible. The one exception being Zack Snyder's Justice League, a preposterously self-indulgent director's cut of the 2017 Justice League film that plays like an omnibus of everything that makes the early phase of the DCEU so insufferable. Not only has the DCEU been mostly not terrible since 2018, the 2 most recent projects in the franchise have been the best DCEU productions yet. They're way better than not terrible. They're good. Really good, like MCU good. And yet, other than the fact that they're about superheroes, drastically different from the MCU, which is also good because I love the MCU, but why do another MCU? There already is one. Anyway, the 2 projects I'm talking about are the movie The Suicide Squad, which came out last year, and the HBO Max original series Peacemaker, which just released the final episode of its first season about a week ago. Aside from both being set in the DCEU, these projects have something very important in common. They are both the products of a certain writer-director by the name of James Gunn. Gunn is no stranger to superheroes. His last major gig before The Suicide Squad was writing and directing 2 Guardians of the Galaxy films, both of which are excellent and stand among my favorite MCU films. Before that, he wrote and directed Super, a brilliant dark comedy starring Rainn Wilson as a brutal vigilante who bludgeons criminals with a wrench. Watching it now, Super plays like a prelude to Gunn's work in the DCEU. Viewed from a certain perspective, Gunn's take on the DCEU might not seem all that different from the murky, sour schlock directed by Zack Snyder that set the initial tone for the franchise. Gunn's The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker, which is a spin-off of The Suicide Squad, are often dark, visually and tonally. They're extremely violent. In fact, Gunn's violence is even more graphic and over-the-top than Snyder's, and they center on characters who are frequently extremely unlikable and unpleasant. Yet, there is a difference. Actually, there are many differences that distinguish Gunn's projects from the early DCEU. The most obvious difference is that while Gunn's productions are dark and violent, they're also very, very funny. There's a sequence in The Suicide Squad where the team reaches a rebel encampment where they believe Rick Flag is being held prisoner. As they make their way across the camp, Bloodsport and Peacemaker engage in a killing contest, silently murdering every rebel they encounter in ever more outlandish and brutal ways. If the scene weren't played for laughs, it would be one of the most gruesome displays of gratuitous violence I've ever seen in a movie. But seen through James Gunn's camera, it's hysterical. That scene is typical of how Gunn handles violence in The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. It's brutal and bloody, but the way it's presented, it comes across as outrageously entertaining mayhem rather than something shocking or upsetting. Which is not to say Gunn always plays violence for a laugh. The finish of Peacemaker's fight with Rick Flag near the end of The Suicide Squad lands pretty hard. And there's a scene in the Peacemaker series where Vigilante cheerfully assassinates an entire family with a sniper rifle that is equal parts funny and chilling. There's also a moment in the penultimate episode of Peacemaker's first season that, perhaps unintentionally, invites a direct parallel to one of the most criticized moments from Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, when Superman straight up manslaughters General Zod. Spoilers coming for Season 1 of Peacemaker. Also, there's going to be spoilers for The Suicide Squad 2 eventually. So, you know what? If you haven't seen either of those and you don't want to know what happens, you probably just shouldn't be watching this yet. Anyway, in the second to last episode of Peacemaker's first season, Stop Dragging My Heart Around, Peacemaker confronts his abusive, racist father, who also happens to be the supervillain White Dragon. The confrontation ends with Peacemaker killing his father, shooting him in the head at point-blank range, then dropping to his knees and crying, a posture very reminiscent of Superman in Man of Steel post-neck snap. What Peacemaker does is arguably even worse, morally speaking, than Superman's killing of Zod, because while neither killing is necessary, we're supposed to think it's necessary in Man of Steel, but it's not, because that's a terribly written film. At least you could argue that Zod is directly threatening people at the moment of his death, and Superman is acting to protect them. White Dragon, on the other hand, is unarmed and not posing an immediate threat to anyone when Peacemaker pops him. And yet, Peacemaker's killing of his father works for me on just about every level, whereas I find Superman's killing of Zod to be representative of everything that's wrong with Man of Steel and, indeed, with Zack Snyder's take on superheroes in general. How can two scenes that are so similar play so differently? In Man of Steel, we're apparently supposed to view Superman's killing of Zod as a kind of tragedy. Superman doesn't want to kill Zod, who, besides being a huge asshole, is one of the only other survivors of Krypton, but Zod's maniacal determination to keep right on murdering people leaves Superman no choice. Or at least, that's the idea. Again, the movie doesn't actually place Superman in a situation where killing Zod is the only option. It just pretends to and hopes we don't notice. But the scene doesn't play that way, at least not for me, because the movie never establishes a relationship between Superman and Zod beyond people who punch each other, nor does it establish that this version of Superman has any particular aversion to killing people or any special respect for human life at all, really. Zod is the only character in the film who he directly kills, but he participates in a few superpowered fistfights in populated areas that almost certainly result in collateral casualties. We never see him acting to protect civilians. He doesn't pull himself away from the fight to save anyone. There's even a brief lull in the action when we see Superman standing in an area of Metropolis that has been destroyed by his fighting with Zod. It looks like the ruins of a bombed city. But instead of searching for survivors, Instead of exhibiting any concern for people who might need his help, Superman chooses to make out with Lois Lane. So, forgive me if my heart doesn't exactly go out to him when he finally shows some emotion after being forced to kill Zod. The Peacemaker series, on the other hand, takes the time to establish that Peacemaker has some very complicated feelings about White Dragon. Peacemaker loves his father and fears his father, who has been controlling him through both physical and emotional abuse for his entire life. Peacemaker is also experiencing some painful and, at times, confusing personal growth. For much of his life, thanks largely to the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, he has been, frankly, a murderer. He tells himself he's a hero, justifies his killings by saying they're in the name of peace, but lately his conscience has been uneasy. Prior to shooting his father, he confides to Harcourt, another member of his team, that he doesn't want to kill people anymore. During their final confrontation, White Dragon berates his son, blaming him unfairly for the death of his brother, telling Peacemaker he should have killed him years ago, and declaring confidently that Peacemaker won't pull the trigger because he doesn't have the guts to kill him. And then Peacemaker kills him, and drops to his knees, and cries. And my heart does go out to him in that moment, because that moment is earned. It means something. It isn't just violence for its own sake. It isn't an adolescent attempt to be edgy or adult, which is the impression given by the vast majority of Zack Snyder's work. It is a moment that the entire narrative has been building to since the beginning. And it works. When Gunn does use violence for something other than a macabre joke, he knows how to make it work. He aims for the gut, and he lands his punches. Which brings me to another element that Gunn's DCEU work has that the earlier entries in the series are sorely lacking: heart. As interpreted by Zack Snyder, the heroes of the Justice League are removed from humanity, placed above the ordinary people they supposedly protect, gods to be admired and feared, burdened by the weight of their responsibilities. The only times we see Snyder's version of Superman acting like something resembling a human being with a personality and compassion for others are in scenes from the generally terrible theatrical cut of Justice League that were written and directed by Joss Whedon, who, according to the public statements of numerous people who have worked with him over the years, is a terrible person, but is at least smart enough to know that Superman only really works if he seems nice and like he cares about other people. Snyder's Superman is a bad hero and a bad person, but neither Snyder nor his films seem to recognize that. The heroes of Gunn's The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are also bad people, most of them anyway, but Gunn is very aware of that. He wants us to recognize that his heroes are not good people. And then he wants us to like them anyway. The arcs of the main characters in The Suicide Squad are virtually all about how these bad people come to a point where they're willing to risk their lives to do the right thing. The members of Task Force X, the official name for the Suicide Squad, are inmates at a prison that specializes in housing supervillains. They join the team for the promise of having their sentences reduced if they succeed, and if they survive, and they stay on the team under the threat of death. Each of them carries an implant in their head that allows their handler, powerful government agent Amanda Waller, to execute them at any moment. At the film's climax, the team defies Waller's orders, knowing that they could be killed for their disobedience, and continues to fight against the gigantic alien monster Starro, despite having technically completed their assigned mission. Bloodsport, the team's leader, also uses information they've uncovered linking the U.S. government to human experimentation involving Starro as leverage to force Waller to free him and the rest of the team. This squad of supervillains experience this sort of character growth primarily because they come to care about each other. They go through an adventure together, a violent, vulgar, bloody adventure, get to know each other, bond, and come to feel responsible for looking out for not just each other, but innocent people who are threatened by Starro as well. The most important superpower is empathy. Actually, I mean, that's really a corny way to say it, but that's the biggest difference between how James Gunn writes these characters and how they're written in Zack Snyder's movies. The characters in The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker are capable of empathy, and we see the power it has to change them. One of the few protagonists in The Suicide Squad who doesn't have that character arc is Peacemaker. He remains loyal to Amanda Waller to the point that he kills Rick Flag to prevent Flag from exposing the government's involvement in the Starro project. But as it turns out, that act and the guilt he feels as a result of it is what starts Peacemaker down the path to growth and redemption that he walks during his HBO Max series. But ultimately, it's not guilt that changes Peacemaker, it's empathy. In the final episode of the first season, the show's top surviving villain, an alien being that has taken over the body of a human police detective, pleads with Peacemaker to join their cause, arguing that their goals, to save humanity from destroying itself and thereby preserving Earth as a suitable habitat for both humanity and her own kind, are the same as Peacemaker's. Peacemaker doesn't join the bad guys, of course. He thwarts the aliens' scheme. Later, Adebayo, a member of Peacemaker's team, asks him why he didn't choose to side with the aliens. Was it because their plan to save humanity from itself contradicted the right-wing libertarian view of freedom he learned from his fascist father? No, Peacemaker says. I didn't join them because I knew they'd hurt you and the others if I did. It wasn't guilt or adherence to a personal code that made Peacemaker choose to destroy the aliens rather than help them. It was that he cared about his friends. Friends he didn't have at the beginning of the series. Like I said, heart. There's one more thing I want to mention about James Gunn's forays into the DCEU that place them head and shoulders above the films that kicked off the franchise. It's the fact that they don't shy away from the oddball and eccentric qualities of the source material. To the contrary, The Suicide Squad and Peacemaker both embrace those qualities. Unlike Snyder and his collaborators, most notably screenwriter David Goyer, Gunn doesn't seem embarrassed by the silliness, the goofiness, the sometimes dizzying weirdness of DC Comics. He recognizes these qualities as features, not bugs. Though Peacemaker also has bugs. A different kind of bugs, alien bugs, that fly tiny spaceships and live in people's brains, which would be an example of what I was just talking about. I guess in that sense, the bugs are a feature in that they exemplify the weirdness. You know what else exemplifies the weirdness? Starro! Yeah, baby! If it were possible to distill into a pair of creative decisions everything that makes James Gunn's contribution to the DCEU better than the sulky fascist wankfests with which the series was inaugurated, it would be the decision to make Steppenwolf and Darkseid, the villains of the Justice League movie, contrasted with the decision to use Starro as the villain of the Suicide Squad. So, here's the thing. In a perfectly just and rational universe, Starro would have been the villain of the first Justice League movie. However, we do not live in that universe. And the people who made the Justice League movie are people who, judging by their work, hate DC Comics. And instead of getting the Justice League versus Starro in a brightly colored superhero adventure, we got, in the Snyder Cut, the Justice League versus two couldn't-be-more generic interplanetary warlord types in an utterly joyless film that looks like someone spilled coffee on it. But The silver lining of the producers of the Justice League movie being oblivious, perpetual fuck-ups who harbor contempt for the source material they're adapting is that it saved Starro for the Suicide Squad, which was a way better movie. Starro in the Suicide Squad is pretty much Starro from the comics. He's a humongous starfish who mind controls people by releasing smaller starfish that attach themselves to people's faces. It is strange, it bears the unmistakable mark of the Silver Age, and it is absolutely delightful. There's more imagination and excitement and sheer demented fun in the Suicide Squad's climactic battle with Starro than there is in Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and both cuts of Justice League combined. Starro isn't the only example of the wonderfully weird side of DC Comics finding its way on screen. Also appearing in the Suicide Squad are King Shark, Polka Dot Man, and the Detachable Kid, whose superpower is that his arms can detach from his body and fly around. It sometimes feels like Gunn assembled his cast of characters by paging through old issues of Wizard magazine and finding every mort of the month. And I can't stress this enough, it works fantastically. Maybe the best example of the way Gunn embraces the weirdness of DC is a character who isn't taken from DC Comics at all. He's an original character created by Gunn for the Peacemaker series. I refer, of course, to Eagly. He's Peacemaker's best friend, and he's an eagle. In terms of his personality, abilities, and overall portrayal in the show, he falls somewhere between an actual eagle and a flat-out cartoon character. As my best friend, podcast co-host, and fellow Peacemaker fanboy Jason Harding put it when we talked about this a few weeks ago, Eagly seems like an eagle from DC Comics. You're never quite sure exactly how smart he is or what he's capable of, though he does seem unbreakably loyal to Peacemaker, and he adds an absurdist, unpredictable element that helps to elevate a show that would have been great without him to become the best superhero streaming series since Marvel closed up shop at Netflix. Before I close this out, it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge that James Gunn is not the first filmmaker working under or adjacent to the DCEU umbrella to figure all this out. In 2019, Shazam captured much of the same spirit, though in a way that was far less bloody and profane. Even without the violence and vulgarity that seasons Gunn's work, Shazam has all the essential elements. The humor, the sense of fun, characters that grow and change throughout the course of the film, and a total lack of self-consciousness about the silliness of the source material. The mythos and cast of villains and supporting characters surrounding Shazam is among the zaniest in the DC Comics canon, and the film doesn't shy away from any of it. Even Mr. Mind, the evil talking caterpillar, makes an appearance. And it all works. Shazam is smart and funny and heartfelt, depicting a superhero who actually cares about using his powers to help people and do the right thing. It's the first film in the DCEU that is consistently good from start to finish, and compared to most of what came before, it is a breath of fresh air. Another sign that maybe the DCEU could turn things around came a year later with the film Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn, a sequel/spinoff to the execrable first Suicide Squad movie that came out in 2016. Birds of Prey is clever, colorful, uproariously funny, with well-staged action sequences, including some truly outstanding fight scenes that are choreographed and shot and cut better than any other scenes of their kind in the entire franchise up to this point. It earns every bit of its R rating, but like the other projects I've been talking about, it doesn't allow its coarser qualities to overwhelm its heart. Ultimately, it's a film about a group of misfits who come together to form a chosen family. A chosen family of brutal vigilantes and semi-reformed criminals, but you know what they say, you can't choose your chosen family. Speaking of oddball surrogate families, There's one more project I want to mention that is in the same spirit as James Gunn's work and the other movies I've just been talking about. It's not actually a part of the DCEU, but I figure it's got to be right next door. I'm talking about HBO Max's Doom Patrol series. Since I've repeatedly complimented the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker, and Shazam for embracing the weird side of DC Comics, it should come as no surprise that I love Doom Patrol, because embracing and exploring that weird side is practically all it does. Also, Doom Patrol has its own version of Cyborg, and he's way better than the DCEU Cyborg because he's an actual character in the story and not just a plot device / exposition dispenser. I should probably also at least mention the Arrowverse family of shows on the CW, which figured all this stuff out years ago and has been humming along ever since, producing shows that have had their creative ups and downs, sure, but have found the balance between humor and drama and given us hundreds of hours of fun, colorful characters having adventures with depth and emotional weight that definitely don't shy away from the silly stuff. So, James Gunn definitely didn't draft the blueprint for how to make good live-action DC Comics adaptations, but he has followed it while playing to his own strengths as a writer and director, creating work that is uniquely his own, that also honors the source material that inspired it. It's a shame it took the brain trust at DC Entertainment and Warner Brothers so long to figure out how to do this, or perhaps I should say, remember how to do this, because Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz figured it out over 40 years ago with Superman the movie. But now that they have figured it out, and now that the franchise seems to have finally shed the dismal, moody teenager aesthetic that doomed its early entries to depressing mediocrity, the future of the DCEU looks bright. That's something I did not expect I'd ever be able to say back in 2016 when I left the theater after seeing Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice and swore off the rest of the franchise. That's an oath I kept for a few years, but eventually I came back, and now I'm glad I did. It's amazing what a difference it makes when you place your superhero movie franchise in the hands of a talented filmmaker who actually likes superheroes, isn't it? Ultimately, it's a film about a group of misfits who come together to form a chosen family. A chosen family of brutal vigilantes and semi-reformed criminals, but you know what they say, you can't choose your chosen family. And I'm just going to sit on it like Bob Hope and stare you down and dare you not to laugh at that.